On a warm afternoon in the spring of 1973, a group of people gathered on the campus of Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. They had come from across the country for a reunion, not a class reunion or a faculty gathering, a family reunion. The Vanderbilt family reunion. The university bore their name on its gates, carved into its stone buildings, embedded in its founding documents. Cornelius Vanderbilt had donated $1 million to establish it back in 1873, the largest philanthropic gift an American had ever made at that point. His name would live forever, he was told. It would endure in these halls long after he was gone. He could not have imagined what enduring would actually look like. The family members who gathered that afternoon compared notes quietly, the way families do at reunions when the real conversations happen in corners and hallways rather than at the main tables. Someone eventually asked the question that everyone had been thinking. Was there anyone present worth $1 million? They looked around the room. They counted carefully. There was not. The family that had once possessed the largest private fortune in American history, a fortune so staggering that when the Commodore died in 1877, he alone held more wealth than existed in the entire United States Treasury, had arrived within 3 generations at a reunion where not a single member could claim to be a millionaire. The mansions were gone, the railroads had been sold, the staff had been dismissed, the jewels had been auctioned, the yachts had been broken up for scrap. What remained was a name on a university gate and the haunting arithmetic of what had been lost. This is the story of how the greatest fortune in American history was built in a single lifetime, doubled in the next, and then scattered across marble floors, costume balls, demolished palaces, and custody courtrooms until almost nothing remained. It is a story about what happens when wealth accumulates faster than wisdom. When grandchildren inherit what their grandparents bled for without understanding the blood that paid for it. When the architecture of a dynasty is mistaken for the dynasty itself. This is the story of the Vanderbilts. And it begins not in a palace, but in a ferry. Chapter 1. The Ferryman. Staten Island, New York, 1794. The island was poor, agricultural, and thoroughly unremarkable. The Vanderbilts, the name would be compressed and anglicized within a generation, were farmers of Dutch descent who had been scratching a living from the same patch of land since the mid-1600s. They were not wealthy. They were not connected. They were not, by any measure that mattered in early American society, destined for anything beyond another generation of modest farming. On May 27, 1794, Cornelius Vanderbilt was born into this family, the 4th of 9 children. His father, also Cornelius, worked a small farm and occasionally ferried goods across New York Harbor in a flat-bottomed boat called a periauger. It was unglamorous, essential, and barely profitable work. Young Cornelius was not a scholar. He showed no interest in books and considerable contempt for formal instruction. What he showed interest in from his earliest years was boats. The mechanics of them, the economics of them, the geography of the harbor they crossed, and the opportunities that existed for someone willing to work harder than everyone else on the water. At 11 years old, he was helping his father on the periauger. At 16, he struck a deal with his mother. If he plowed and planted an 8-acre field that had been left fallow because it was too difficult to cultivate, she would lend him $100. He plowed the field. He collected the money. On May 27, 1810, his 16th birthday, Cornelius Vanderbilt bought his first boat. It was a periauger, 2 masts, a shallow draft, big enough to carry passengers and cargo between Staten Island and Manhattan across New York Harbor. He charged 25 cents a trip. The harbor was busy. The city was growing, and Cornelius Vanderbilt discovered something about himself that no school could have taught him. He understood at a molecular level how to move things from where they were to where they needed to be faster and cheaper than anyone else. That understanding, applied over 6 decades, would make him the richest man in America. By the end of his first summer of operation, he had paid back his mother's loan and turned a profit. He hired his brothers to help crew additional boats. He watched which routes were profitable and which weren't. He underbid competitors when necessary and raised prices when he had leverage. He was not charming or refined. He swore constantly. He chewed tobacco and spat on floors. He had no patience for social niceties or formal correspondence. What he had was an almost supernatural instinct for commercial opportunity and an absolute refusal to lose. During the War of 1812, he secured a government contract to supply the forts around New York Harbor. He was 18 years old and already running a small fleet. When the war ended, he was solvent and experienced, while many of his competitors were neither. In 1818, a successful businessman named Thomas Gibbons hired Vanderbilt to run a steamboat line operating between New Jersey and New York. Vanderbilt accepted and moved his family to New Brunswick, where his wife Sophia ran a tavern that became a popular stop for travelers. For 11 years, he worked for Gibbons, learning the steamboat business from inside a successful operation. He absorbed everything: how to manage crews, how to negotiate docking rights, how to price routes, how to wage commercial warfare against competitors with political connections. When Gibbons died in 1829, Vanderbilt was 35 years old. He had saved enough money and learned enough about the steamboat industry to launch his own operation. He did so immediately. What followed was 2 decades of systematic, ruthless commercial expansion that no competitor survived intact. Vanderbilt entered markets, slashed prices until competitors were losing money, waited them out, bought them out, or simply destroyed them. He entered the Hudson River routes, then Long Island Sound, then the routes to New England. Each time he arrived as a disruptor, forced prices down for consumers, and either drove out rivals or extracted payment to leave markets alone. One group of competitors paid him $100,000 and $5,000 monthly just to stay out of their route. He took the money and left. By the 1840s, Cornelius Vanderbilt was a millionaire. In an era when that word meant something almost incomprehensible to ordinary Americans, he was a millionaire many times over. But steamboats, he understood, were already becoming obsolete. The future moved on rails. Chapter 2. The Railroad. The railroads changed everything they touched. By the 1850s, it was clear to anyone watching carefully that rail would replace water as the primary means of American transportation. Vanderbilt watched carefully. He began acquiring railroad stock in the early 1960s. He was already in his late 60s, an age at which most men of his era were long retired or dead. He moved into railroads the way he had moved into every previous market, with patience, with aggression, and with a clarity of purpose that his rivals consistently underestimated. His initial target was the New York and Harlem line, a struggling line that connected Manhattan with the northern suburbs. He bought controlling interest quietly, improved operations, and watched the stock climb. Then he moved to the Hudson River Railroad. Then, in the move that defined his legacy, he set his sights on the New York Central, the most important railroad in America, connecting New York City to Chicago along the most heavily traveled corridor in the country. His method for acquiring the New York Central was characteristic. When the railroad's management refused to negotiate, Vanderbilt cut off their connecting service in the dead of winter, stranding passengers and freight. The public was furious. The New York Central stock collapsed. Vanderbilt bought it at the bottom and offered to restore service. The deal was made. By 1869, Vanderbilt controlled a continuous rail line from New York City to Chicago. He consolidated his holdings into the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad. He rebuilt the infrastructure, improved the equipment, and made the line profitable on a scale its previous owners had never imagined. He commissioned Grand Central Depot in Manhattan, a massive terminal that announced the railroad's ambition to the city. The numbers produced by this empire were staggering. The New York Central was generating revenues that dwarfed anything Vanderbilt had managed in the steamboat years. Stock dividends flowed into his accounts constantly. He reinvested some and held the rest. His fortune grew not by spending down, but by the sheer compounding velocity of a transportation monopoly at the center of American commerce. When Cornelius Vanderbilt died on January 4, 1877, at the age of 82, he left behind an estate valued at approximately $105 million. $105 million in 1877. The United States Treasury held less. No American had ever accumulated such a sum. It was, by any measure, the largest private fortune the country had produced. He left the overwhelming majority of it, roughly $95 million, to his son William Henry Vanderbilt, with smaller amounts distributed among his other children and grandchildren. The logic was clear, if brutal. Dividing the fortune equally among his many heirs would fragment what had taken a lifetime to assemble. Concentrating it in one capable pair of hands would preserve its power. William Henry was considered capable. He had managed the family's Staten Island railway properties competently. He understood the railroad business. He was conservative, methodical, and serious about money. He would prove in the 8 years remaining to him to be even better at multiplying a fortune than his father had been at building one. Chapter 3. The Doubling. William Henry Vanderbilt is one of the most underappreciated figures in American financial history. When his father died and left him the largest private fortune in the country, he did not celebrate. He did not build a palace. He did not throw elaborate parties. He went to work. He managed the New York Central with the same operational discipline his father had applied. He cut costs without sacrificing quality. He expanded the network strategically. He navigated the complex political environment of railroad regulation without catastrophic missteps. He paid attention. And then, between 1879 and 1883, he sold his controlling stake in the New York Central to a syndicate of American and British investors in the largest stock sale in American history to that point. His reasons were partly strategic. He believed railroad regulation would eventually compress profits, and partly personal. He wanted to secure his wealth in a form less vulnerable to political attack. The sale generated cash on a scale that even his father's fortune hadn't reached in liquid form. Combined with the appreciation of his existing holdings and 8 years of dividend income, William Henry Vanderbilt had, by the early 1880s, more than doubled the fortune he had inherited. His personal wealth stood at approximately $200 million. In 8 years, he had taken the largest private fortune in American history and made it larger. He also, in those same years, began doing something his father had never bothered with. He started spending it visibly. The twin brownstone mansions he built at 640-642 Fifth Avenue in 1879 were the beginning. Not yet the grandest structures on the avenue, but a signal of intent. He commissioned elaborate interiors filled with European art and antiques. He began collecting paintings on a serious scale. He hosted dinners for political figures and business associates in rooms that announced wealth without screaming it. William Henry Vanderbilt died on December 8, 1885, of a stroke suffered during a business meeting. He was 64 years old. 8 years as the family patriarch. In those 8 years, he had doubled the fortune and begun transforming the Vanderbilt family into something resembling the American aristocracy his father had been too busy building wealth to care about. He left his estate divided among his 8 children, 4 sons and 4 daughters, with the largest portions going to his 2 eldest sons, Cornelius II and William Kissam. Each received approximately $67 million. The remainder was distributed among the other 6 children. This was the first division. The fortune remained enormous. Each of the major heirs was, individually, extraordinarily wealthy. But the logic of division had begun. What had been concentrated in one pair of hands was now scattered across 8 households, 8 sets of priorities, 8 different ideas about what the Vanderbilt name should mean and how it should be expressed. Those 8 households would now begin to compete. Chapter 4. The Palace Wars. Fifth Avenue in the 1880s was a construction site. The Vanderbilts arrived on the avenue the way their family had always arrived in new territory, all at once and with overwhelming force. Between 1879 and 1995, the Vanderbilt family built or significantly expanded no fewer than 11 major residences. On Fifth Avenue alone, their properties eventually stretched across multiple blocks, an unbroken string of limestone palaces that New Yorkers called Vanderbilt Row. Cornelius II, the eldest son and family patriarch after his father's death, commissioned the most significant. He took the existing brownstone mansion at the corner of 5th Avenue and 57th Street that his father had built and expanded it, then expanded it again until by 1894 it occupied the entire block face between 57th and 58th Streets and stretched from 5th Avenue to Madison. 130 rooms, multiple ballrooms, a grand hall rising 3 stories with carved oak paneling and a stained glass window designed by John Lafarge, a dining room that seated 60 beneath gilded ceilings, a library holding rare books in custom-built cases, a billiard room, a gymnasium, a children's schoolroom, servants' quarters housing dozens of staff. The house cost over $3 million to construct and another $2 million to furnish. Its architect, George Brown Post, designed it in the French Renaissance style that the Vanderbilts had claimed as their signature. Limestone, steep roofs, carved stone ornament covering every surface. His brother, William Kissam, built on a parallel track. His mansion at 660 Fifth Avenue, designed by Richard Morris Hunt and completed in 1882, was equally dramatic. French Gothic, gray limestone, medieval tapestries hung in rooms paneled in carved wood imported from European estates. His wife, Alva, a woman of ferocious social ambition and genuine aesthetic intelligence, oversaw every detail of its construction and decoration. The brothers were not collaborating, they were competing, and neither of them built the most dramatic Vanderbilt residence of the era. That distinction belonged to their younger brother, George Washington Vanderbilt II, who took his inheritance south to the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina and built something that made even his brother's Fifth Avenue palaces look modest by comparison. But George's story deserves its own telling, because what he built in Asheville would be the only Vanderbilt residence to survive the century intact. Newport, Rhode Island became a second front in the Palace Wars. The summer colony there had been fashionable for decades, but the Vanderbilts redefined it. Alva Vanderbilt commissioned Marble House in 1892, an $11 million summer cottage designed to evoke the Grand Trianon at Versailles. 500,000 cubic feet of marble imported from different countries, a ballroom in the Chinese style, a Gothic room assembled from pieces of genuine medieval architecture. Alva called it a cottage. She understood the social power of irony. Not to be outdone, Cornelius II's wife, Alice, commissioned the breakers in 1893 after the original structure on the Newport oceanfront burned. She and her husband hired Richard Morris Hunt to design a replacement. What Hunt delivered was a 70-room Italian Renaissance palazzo, its great hall modeled on a Genoese courtyard, its loggia opening directly to the Atlantic Ocean. The fireplaces burned alabaster, the ceilings were painted. The bathtubs were supplied with both fresh and salt water, both hot and cold. 14 family bedrooms, 30 additional rooms for staff, a complete staff wing with its own kitchen, dining room, and sitting areas. The breakers cost approximately $7 million in 1895. To maintain it during the summer season required a permanent staff of 40, supplemented by additional temporary workers for major entertainments. And Newport was only used for 8 to 12 weeks per year. During those weeks, the social competition was constant and exhausting. Who had the best ball? Who had the most distinguished guest list? Whose table was most elaborately set? Whose daughters had the most promising suitors? The women of the Vanderbilt generation, Alva, Alice, and their circles, managed these competitions with the seriousness of military campaigns. But underneath all of this architectural magnificence, an older woman was watching with cold calculation, and she would reshape the family's future more completely than any architect or interior decorator ever could. Chapter 5. The Ball That Bought Their Way In. Caroline Astor controlled New York society the way the Commodore had controlled harbor traffic, absolutely and without apology. The Vanderbilts, despite their $200 million fortune, despite their Fifth Avenue mansions, despite their Newport cottages, were not yet inside the circle that Caroline Astor defined and defended. The Commodore had been too rough, too openly commercial, too unwilling to pretend that money and work were separate things. His son William Henry had been better, but his short tenure and sudden death had not allowed the family to complete the transition from new money to established money. Alva Vanderbilt understood this with perfect clarity, and she decided to resolve it with a single evening. The costume ball of March 26, 1883, was the most expensive and most socially significant private party in American history to that point. Alva had been planning it for months. The newly completed mansion at 660 Fifth Avenue would host 1,200 guests. They would come in costumes representing the courts of European royalty, historical figures from antiquity, allegorical figures from mythology. The decorations alone required weeks to install. Flowers arrived by the cartload. The caterers prepared food for 1,200 people across multiple courses. The cost exceeded $250,000, equivalent today to something approaching $8 million for a single evening of entertainment. But the real genius of all the strategy was not the spectacle, it was the guest list. Every major family in New York society received an invitation, except one. Caroline Astor herself had not been invited. The reason, Alva let it be known through the precise social telegraph of calling cards and drawing room conversations, was simple. Mrs. Astor had never formally called on the Vanderbilts. Until she did, proper social protocol prevented them from reciprocating, and without a formal call, an invitation was impossible. Caroline Astor's daughter had been rehearsing a quadrille for weeks with her friends in anticipation of the ball. She desperately wanted to attend. The other young women in her group were already confirmed guests. The message was received clearly. Within days, Caroline Astor sent her calling card to the Vanderbilt mansion. Alva received it. The invitation followed immediately. On the evening of March 26, 1883, Caroline Astor arrived at 660 Fifth Avenue in her costume. She stayed until the early hours of the morning. When she left, the Vanderbilts were inside the circle she had defended for years. The woman who had decided who mattered in New York had acknowledged, publicly and undeniably, that the Vanderbilts mattered. The victory was total. But it was also, in retrospect, the moment when the family's trajectory shifted from building wealth to spending it. Having arrived at the top of the social mountain, the instinct was now to decorate the summit, to host more elaborate gatherings, to build more magnificent houses, to demonstrate membership in the club that had taken 30 years to enter. The Commodore had never cared about any of this. He had spent his life building commercial infrastructure and accumulating the profits it generated. His son, William Henry, had doubled the fortune and only begun in his final years to spend significantly. But the third generation, the grandchildren who had been born into wealth rather than fighting for it, had grown up watching social competition as the primary occupation of intelligent, ambitious people. They were about to compete extraordinarily well, and it was going to cost them everything. Chapter 6. The Man Who Worked Himself to Death. Of all the third-generation Vanderbilts, Cornelius II most resembled the Commodore in temperament. He was serious, hard-working, deeply religious, and genuinely concerned with the management of the family's financial interests. He served on the boards of multiple railroad companies. He maintained careful oversight of the family's substantial investments. He took the responsibility of the Vanderbilt name seriously in ways his siblings often did not. He was also killing himself with the effort. The weight of managing a $67 million fortune, serving simultaneously on the boards of the New York Central and numerous other corporations, overseeing the construction and maintenance of multiple residences, raising a family of 7 children, and acting as the de facto head of the Vanderbilt clan after his father's death. All of this was more than one human body could sustain indefinitely. In 1896, Cornelius II suffered a severe stroke. He was 52 years old. The stroke left him partially paralyzed and significantly diminished in his ability to conduct business at the level he had maintained. He struggled on for 3 more years, refusing to fully step back, unwilling to concede the ground he had spent his adult life claiming. On September 12, 1899, Cornelius II died. He was 55 years old. He had worked himself to death managing an inheritance. His estate was divided among his surviving children. The eldest son, Alfred, just 25 years old, received the largest portion, approximately $42 million, and control of the family's main business interests. The other children received smaller portions. His widow, Alice, received a life interest in the breakers. But the most revealing detail of Cornelius II's will was not the distribution to his children. It was the exclusion of one. His second son, Reginald, and, more consequentially, his son Cornelius III, had disappointed him in ways he considered fundamental. He reduced Cornelius III's inheritance dramatically, leaving him a fraction of what the other children received. Cornelius III had made the error of marrying a woman his parents considered unsuitable without their blessing. His father cut him accordingly. The Vanderbilts were beginning to fight each other. Chapter 7. The Dream in the Mountains. While his brothers competed on Fifth Avenue and in Newport, George Washington Vanderbilt II went south. George was the youngest of William Henry's sons, quieter and more intellectually inclined than his siblings. He read widely and seriously. He collected books, art, and ideas. He had no interest in the railroad business or in the social competitions of New York season. He wanted to build something different. In 1888, at 25 years old, George began acquiring land near Asheville, North Carolina. The Blue Ridge Mountains offered clean air and extraordinary scenery. He had visited the area and found something he hadn't expected to feel, a connection to the land itself, to the possibility of creating not just a house, but a working estate that could be managed as a self-sustaining agricultural and forestry operation. By the time he finished acquiring property, George owned 125,000 acres, almost 200 square miles of mountain land. He hired Richard Morris Hunt, the architect his family favored, and Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape designer who had created Central Park in New York. Together, the 3 men spent years developing the plans for what would become Biltmore, a 250-room French Renaissance chateau set on a mountain ridge overlooking the Swannanoa River Valley, surrounded by forests, farms, gardens, and infrastructure on a scale that made even the Newport cottages seem modest. Construction began in 1889. George employed up to 1,000 workers at a time. Materials came from across the country and Europe. Indiana limestone for the exterior, marble for the floors, a library of 10,000 books, a banquet hall modeled on a medieval great hall 60 feet high, hung with Flemish tapestries, a winter garden, a swimming pool, a gymnasium, a bowling alley, an observatory, 34 master bedrooms, 43 bathrooms. Biltmore opened on Christmas Eve, 1895. It was the largest private residence ever built in the United States. That distinction remains uncontested to this day. But here is what separated George's dream from his siblings' palace wars. He actually intended Biltmore to function. He established a working farm with prize cattle and pigs. He partnered with Gifford Pinchot, who would later become the first chief of the United States Forest Service, to develop scientifically managed forestry practices on the estate's vast acreage. He created a dairy, a nursery, agricultural operations that were meant to make the estate economically viable. The vision was magnificent. The economics were merciless. Even with 125,000 acres of timber and farmland, even with ambitious commercial operations, the cost of maintaining a 250-room house with its necessary staff consumed money faster than the estate's enterprises could generate it. George Vanderbilt died in March of 1914 at the age of 51, following complications from an appendectomy. He left Biltmore to his wife Cornelia and their young daughter. Within a decade, Cornelia would be forced to sell 86,000 acres of the estate's forests to the federal government, land that became the nucleus of the Pisgah National Forest, simply to cover the costs of maintaining what remained. The dream in the mountains survived, but only barely and only through radical transformation. Today, Biltmore operates as a privately owned tourist attraction, charging admission to the 1.5 million visitors who tour it annually. It is the only Vanderbilt estate still owned and operated by a Vanderbilt descendant, and it survives precisely because it opened its doors to the paying public, a decision the Commodore, who charged 25 cents a ferry ride and never apologized for it, might have appreciated. Chapter 8. When the money began to vanish. The Vanderbilt fortune did not disappear in a single catastrophic event. There was no fraud, no fire, no single terrible decision that consumed $200 million overnight. The fortune dissolved, the way large fortunes almost always dissolve, gradually, then suddenly, through the patient arithmetic of spending more than you earn across enough years and enough generations. By the early 1900s, the arithmetic had already turned negative for most branches of the family. The costs were real and relentless. Maintaining the Fifth Avenue mansion that Cornelius II had expanded to 130 rooms required 30 to 50 full-time domestic staff year-round. Newport demanded another 40 during the summer season. Biltmore needed a small army. The various townhouses, country retreats, and European trips added more. When you tallied the total household expenses of the major Vanderbilt branches in 1900, the combined annual spending ran into the millions, year after year after year. Against this, the income from invested fortunes, while substantial, was finite. The railroad stocks that had generated the family's wealth were paying dividends, but those dividends were not infinite, and the principal could only generate so much. And as each generation arrived, inheritance taxes, though modest in the early 1900s compared to what would come, took their share. Alfred Gwynn Vanderbilt, who had inherited the largest portion of Cornelius II's estate, was generous, charming, and genuinely liked by almost everyone who met him. He was also spectacularly indifferent to financial management. He raced horses. He coached four-in-hand carriages. He maintained Newport, a Manhattan mansion, a country retreat in England, and a box at the opera. He threw money at enthusiasms the way his grandfather had thrown money at railroad expansion, except that railroad expansion generated returns and his enthusiasms did not. On May 7, 1915, Alfred Vanderbilt boarded the Lusitania in Liverpool for the return voyage to New York. The ship carried nearly 2,000 passengers. Somewhere in the Irish Sea, a German submarine fired a single torpedo. The Lusitania sank in 18 minutes. Alfred was 37 years old. Witnesses reported that he spent the final minutes before the ship went under giving his life vest to a young woman who had none and helping others into lifeboats. He did not survive. His estate, once worth $42 million, had been reduced through years of extravagant spending to approximately $26 million. Still an enormous sum, but the direction of travel was unmistakable. His brother, Reginald Vanderbilt, inherited nothing. He had spent his share of the family fortune on thoroughbred horses, gambling debts, and a lifestyle of such sustained excess that by the early 1920s he had burned through millions and was surviving largely on loans and the charity of other family members. He died of cirrhosis of the liver in 1925 at the age of 45. His primary legacy was an infant daughter from his second marriage, a girl named Gloria, whose story would carry the Vanderbilt name into a new and far darker chapter. Cornelius III, the son who had been partially disinherited for marrying without permission, had taken his reduced inheritance and spent his adult life in a state of chronic, dignified financial strain. He sued his father's estate. He lived in a style slightly beyond what his means supported. He died in 1942, having never recovered the standing within the family that his father's will had stripped from him. William Kissam Vanderbilt, Alva's husband, had divorced Alva in 1895 in a scandal that shocked even a society growing accustomed to Vanderbilt shocks. Alva had wanted the divorce and engineered it with characteristic directness and efficiency. William Kissam retreated into a life of international travel, yacht racing, and automobile enthusiasm. He was one of the driving forces behind the first automobile races on Long Island. He was genial and completely uninterested in accumulating anything. He spent freely and died in 1920 with a substantially reduced estate. Alva herself, freed from the marriage and in possession of a generous settlement, turned her formidable intelligence and organizational energy towards women's suffrage. She became one of the movement's most effective fundraisers and strategists. She funded campaigns, organized rallies, and used her social position to force the suffrage question onto the agendas of people who had preferred to ignore it. When the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, giving American women the right to vote, Alva Vanderbilt was among those who had made it happen. She died in 1933 in Paris, having spent her fortune with purpose and without regret. The pattern across the generations was consistent. Fortunes that had been enormous in 1885 were manageable but diminished by 1905 and seriously strained by 1920. The income tax, introduced in 1913 and dramatically raised to fund the First World War, claimed significant portions of what the investments generated. Inheritance taxes compounded the losses between generations, and the sheer cost of maintaining the lifestyle that the Vanderbilt name seemed to require was relentless. Then the mansions began to come down. Chapter 9. The Demolitions. 45 years, that is how long the greatest private residence in New York City stood before the wrecking crews arrived. The Cornelius Vanderbilt II mansion at 5th Avenue and 57th Street was demolished in 1927. 130 rooms, a city block of limestone and marble, and carved stone and gold leaf and oak paneling, built to last forever. Destroyed because nobody in the family could afford the $30,000 annual property tax bill, let alone the full carrying costs that pushed annual expenses toward $250,000 or more. Cornelius III inherited the property from his mother, Alice, after her death in 1934. He looked at the numbers and made the same calculation that wealthy families across New York were making about their Fifth Avenue palaces. The numbers did not work. The property taxes alone exceeded what a reasonable return on invested capital could cover without drawing down principal. Adding heating, electricity, maintenance, insurance, and minimal staff produced a figure that made keeping the house an act of financial self-destruction. He sold to Bergdorf Goodman, the luxury department store that had been eyeing the location for years. They wanted the land. The building was irrelevant to them except as an obstacle. Photographs taken during the demolition show the mansion being methodically disassembled from the top down. The slate roof tiles removed first, then the upper floors. The carved limestone facade with gaping holes where windows had been. Interior rooms exposed to the New York sky. The elaborate plasterwork and gold leaf dripping with morning rain before the wrecking crews got to them. The grand staircase leading nowhere as the floors above it were carried away. Some architectural elements were salvaged and sold to collectors. Most went to landfill. Where the greatest private house in American history had stood, Bergdorf Goodman built a new store, Art Deco, clean lines, open to anyone who could afford to shop there, which was a far broader public than had ever been admitted to the mansion it replaced. The Fifth Avenue demolitions were not limited to the Cornelius II mansion. One by one, across the late 1920s and 1930s, the palaces came down. The Vanderbilt brownstones that William Henry had built in 1879, the William Kissam mansion that Alva had commissioned, the associated townhouses and secondary properties. Each demolition made economic sense. Each one made the boulevard a little less recognizable to anyone who had known it in its gilded prime. Newport fared slightly better because the cottages were summer properties rather than year-round residences, making their carrying costs more manageable. The Breakers remained in the family. Cornelius II's widow Alice lived there until her death in 1934, and subsequently Countess Segeni, their daughter Gladys, maintained it. But Gladys could not afford the operating costs either. In 1948, she struck an arrangement with the Preservation Society of Newport County, leasing the Breakers to the society for a nominal fee in exchange for them covering the maintenance and opening it to tourists for admission. The house that had once closed its doors to anyone without an engraved invitation now collected entry fees from summer tourists who came to see how the other half had once lived. The Vanderbilts were still nominally in residence. A small apartment on the upper floors remained the family's private space, but the mansion itself had become a museum. It was a dignified compromise. It was also a measure of how far the distance had traveled from 1895, when Cornelius II and Alice had hosted 300 guests in the Great Hall beneath painted ceilings, to 1950, when paying visitors filed through rope barriers to photograph the same room. Chapter 10. Little Gloria. Of all the stories that emerged from the Vanderbilt dissolution, none was stranger and sadder than the life of Gloria Vanderbilt, daughter of the dissolute Reginald who had drunk himself to death in 1925. Gloria was 18 months old when her father died. Her mother, also named Gloria, Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, was a beautiful, sophisticated woman who had been born in Switzerland and raised in Europe, who loved Paris society and had married Reginald Vanderbilt at age 17 for reasons that mixed genuine attachment with an accurate assessment of his fortune. What remained of that fortune when Reginald died was far less than anyone had expected. He left approximately $5 million encumbered with debts. A trust was established for young Gloria, with income designated for her care. Her mother received a stipend to cover the expenses of raising the child in appropriate Vanderbilt style. What followed over the next decade was one of the most sensational custody battles in American history. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt was not equipped for motherhood and made little pretense of being so. She left young Gloria in the care of a nanny, a woman named Emma Sullivan Kieslick, whom the child called Dodo, and spent most of her time traveling Europe with her twin sister Thelma and the social circles they inhabited. The lifestyle was expensive, and the trust's income insufficient to support it at the level Gloria Morgan preferred. The child's paternal grandmother, Alice Gwynn Vanderbilt, the same formidable woman who had commissioned the Breakers and managed the social obligations of the Vanderbilt family patriarch's position for decades, watched this situation with growing alarm. In 1934, she arranged for her son's widow, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, a sculptor of genuine talent who had founded what would become the Whitney Museum of American Art, to file for legal custody of little Gloria. The trial that followed lasted weeks and generated front-page coverage across the country. It was called the trial of the century before that phrase had been applied to any other trial. Every detail of Gloria Morgan's lifestyle was examined in open court: her relationships, her finances, her absences from her daughter's life, her conduct in European hotels and on ocean liners. The child herself was questioned by the judge in his chambers. The courtroom testimony revealed a world of enormous wealth reduced to tawdry financial manipulation. The Vanderbilt name, which had once connoted railroad empires and Fifth Avenue palaces, was now being debated in the context of whether a child's mother was fit to raise her. The court awarded primary custody to Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. Little Gloria would live with her aunt during the school year and spend summers with her mother. The arrangement was presented as being in the child's best interests. It was also a final public confirmation that the Vanderbilt family was no longer managing its affairs from a position of strength. Gloria Vanderbilt grew up in the shadow of this trial and this name. She became a painter, a writer, a fashion designer.
She attached her name to a line of designer jeans in the 1970s that sold tens of millions of pairs and made her, briefly, independently wealthy. She married 4 times. She wrote about her childhood, her mother's failures, her longing for normalcy in a life defined by abnormality. She had 4 sons. The youngest, born in 1967, was named Anderson Hayes Cooper. Chapter 11. The Last Vanderbilt. Anderson Cooper became a journalist. He joined CNN and built a career covering wars, disasters, and the nightly cascade of American news. He became one of the most recognized faces in American television journalism, a position he earned through talent, hard work, and genuine seriousness about the craft. His mother died in June 2019 at the age of 95. She had been, by the end, the most famous surviving Vanderbilt, a celebrity in her own right, whose name still carried the weight of the dynasty that had built America's railroads and raised its grandest palaces. After her death, Anderson Cooper spoke publicly about the inheritance he had not received. Gertrude Vanderbilt had spent her money during her lifetime, on her apartment, on art, on the expenses of a long and eventful life. She did not believe in passing wealth to children. She had told her son this directly. She wanted him to understand that his future would be built by his own effort, not by the accident of his surname. Anderson Cooper, speaking about this publicly, said that he agreed with her philosophy. He had never expected to inherit. He had built his career independently. He did not present this as a grievance. He presented it as, if anything, a gift. The necessity of self-reliance that the earlier Vanderbilts had been denied by the sheer scale of what they inherited.
He was, by any measure, the most accomplished member of the Vanderbilt line in generations, and the fortune that the Commodore had accumulated, that William Henry had doubled, that the third generation had scattered across limestone palaces and costume balls and racehorses and gambling debts, that fortune had reached him in the amount of exactly nothing. The arithmetic of decline was complete. The Commodore had possessed $105 million in 1877. In terms of purchasing power and proportion of the national economy, that sum represented something closer to $300 billion in modern terms, a fortune that would have placed him among the richest people who have ever lived. Within 30 years of his death, the fortune had been divided. Within 60 years, most of it was gone. Within 100 years, the reunion on the Vanderbilt University campus could not find a single millionaire in the family. In the 140 years since the Commodore died, the compound interest on $105 million, if simply invested in a diversified portfolio generating a modest annual return, would have grown to something incomprehensible, a sum running into the trillions. The Vanderbilts spent that inheritance instead. They spent it on houses that were demolished, on parties that were forgotten before mourning, on divorces that generated legal fees, on horses that lost races, on suits of armor and Flemish tapestries and private yachts and endless European travel, and the endless, ruinous performance of being the Vanderbilts. Chapter 12. What Remains. Stand on the corner of 5th Avenue and 57th Street in New York City today. Look at the Bergdorf Goodman building that occupies the block where the greatest private house in American history once stood. There is no plaque on the wall, no marker in the sidewalk, no acknowledgement that for 45 years a limestone palace sat on this precise location, that 1,200 guests attended a costume ball here in 1883, that a family lived here with 40 servants and 2 ballrooms and a 3-story hall with a stained glass window designed by one of America's greatest artists. The building is simply gone. The land is simply commercial. The block is simply a block. Drive to Newport, Rhode Island, and pay the admission fee at the Breakers. Walk through the Great Hall where Cornelius II and Alice once received the most powerful people in America. See the marble fireplaces and the painted ceilings and the loggia opening to the Atlantic. The house is magnificent, still, in a way that photographs cannot fully convey. But you are a tourist now, not a guest. The ropes and the docents and the audio guide are there precisely because the house no longer belongs to anyone who might invite you. Drive south to Asheville, North Carolina, and visit Biltmore, where George's dreams survived through the practical compromise of admission tickets and a hotel and a winery and the full apparatus of heritage tourism. The house itself is as George built it: the banquet hall, the library, the winter garden, the view from the terrace over the French Broad River Valley toward the Blue Ridge Mountains. It is extraordinary. It is also, finally, sustainable in a way that George's original vision was not, because it has opened itself to the public that the Vanderbilts, in their prime, worked hard to exclude. What the Vanderbilts left behind tells a story about the nature of inherited wealth that is almost mathematical in its clarity. The Commodore built something. William Henry doubled it. The third generation mistook the monument for the foundation. They spent their inherited capital on things that could not generate returns, houses that deteriorated, parties that ended at dawn, social competitions that produced nothing except the temporary satisfaction of having won them. The fourth and fifth generations received fragments of fragments and made what they could of them. Some did so with dignity. Gloria Vanderbilt made her own career. Anderson Cooper made his own career. Others faded into the pleasant anonymity of comfortable lives in the upper middle class, their surnames no longer opening the doors their great-grandparents had fought to enter. There is a lesson here that the Vanderbilts demonstrate more clearly than almost any other family in American history, precisely because the scale of what they had and what they lost is so dramatic that it cannot be explained away. The Commodore understood something that his grandchildren never learned. Wealth is a process, not a possession. It is generated by activity, by movement, by the constant application of intelligence to opportunity. The moment you stop treating it as a process and start treating it as an inheritance, it begins to shrink. He had built his fortune by moving things, passengers, freight, capital, from where they were to where they needed to be, faster and cheaper and more reliably than anyone else. His children and grandchildren stopped moving things and started decorating rooms. The rooms are gone. The movement is what survives. Vanderbilt University still stands in Nashville, Tennessee. Nearly 13,000 students attend each year. Its medical center treats hundreds of thousands of patients annually. Its law school and business school train professionals who will spend their careers contributing to the economy that the Commodore helped build. The $1 million that Cornelius Vanderbilt donated in 1873, a fortune that seemed inexhaustible at the time, has generated more lasting value through this institution than all the millions spent on the limestone palaces of Fifth Avenue combined. The irony is almost too neat to believe. The man who built the greatest fortune in American history, who cared nothing for social approval, who spat tobacco and swore at business rivals and ran his ferries in winter storms while more refined men stayed indoors, left his most enduring monument not in marble or limestone, but in the education of generations of students who never gave him a second thought. Somewhere in Nashville, a student walks through the gates of Vanderbilt University and sees the name carved in stone. She is probably thinking about her next class, or the paper due at midnight, or what she is going to have for lunch. She is not thinking about Staten Island ferries, or Fifth Avenue palaces, or the 1973 reunion where the family discovered, with quiet astonishment, that they had spent it all. The Commodore would have understood. He had always known that the point was not the monument. The point was the movement. His grandchildren forgot that, and the fortune that could have lasted forever lasted instead about 90 years. That is the story of the Vanderbilts. And if it sounds familiar, if the shape of this rise and ruin echoes something you have seen before, in other names, in other mansions, in other dynasties that built and lost and were forgotten, then you understand what this channel is here to explore. Because the Vanderbilts were not an exception, they were a warning. Gilded Ruins, new episodes every week. Subscribe so you don't miss what falls next.